Good day, everyone. My name is Peter Kappers. I'm from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and together with my colleague Travis Duville from the Pacific Northwest National Lab, we want to thank you for joining us today for this recorded version of our webinar titled The Evolution of Resource Accreditation. First and foremost, if you could jump to the next slide, we want to thank the funders for this activity. The Department of Energy is providing funding to a number of different national labs. The parts of DOE that is funding this are the newly created Office of Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation, the Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, as well as the Office of Electricity. And without them and their generous support, we could not make this webinar series possible. So let me tell you a little bit about the webinar series itself. This is the seventh last in the webinar series itself. So we kicked off initially by providing an overview of the topics we were going to cover, as well as how the forecasting and resource adequacy issues that we were going to discuss over the course of these webinars connected to state planning efforts. We then moved on to focus 3 webinars on the topic of forecasting, first providing a general overview, methods, techniques, models, as well as some best practices. We then moved on to specifically looking at forecasts associated with load expansion, as well as distributed energy resources. That closed up our segment on forecasting, and then we moved into resource adequacy. And so we started talking about some basics, again, tools, topics, methods associated with resource adequacy analysis. We then moved into transmission and distribution system planning, again, talking about tools and methods and techniques. And then the one you're here to listen to today is the evolution of resource accreditation. And so with that, let me hand things over to my colleague, Travis, to get things going.
Thanks, Pete, and good day, everyone, wherever you are. I'm Travis, as Pete mentioned, and I'm speaking to you from PNNL's Portland Research Center, where I have been researching energy planning, systems integration, and techno-economic valuation alongside my fantastic colleagues, some of whom you've heard from in this webinar series since 2019. I've really enjoyed the content of this series and would like to thank Pete and the team for the opportunity to be part of it today. As we wade into this topic, please note that the agenda for today is structured to provide a foundation on the topic of resource accreditation and then funnel into conventional accreditation concepts, present various approaches which have emerged over the last 10 to 20 years, and conclude with an emerging focus on marginal resource accreditation. From the top of this slide, we'll start with some context regarding how systems are planned for long-term reliability within regulated and restructured wholesale markets, and we will define the term accreditation. Next, we'll review key principles of accreditation as described by some of the leading work in this field. Then we will begin to funnel down by presenting conventional accreditation approaches of ICAP and UCAP, more on those acronyms in a moment, and how they work with planning reserve margins to yield adequate systems. Key reasons for why more refined methods are needed will be presented next. The remainder of the material trades deterministic against probabilistic, prospective against retrospective, and marginal against average approaches to accreditation. More detail will be provided on the marginal methods, which have arisen in the last 5 years as the most efficient planning tools for resource adequacy and capacity across systems. And finally, we'll summarize these concepts to recap everything we've talked about today. As we start, it is important for us to recall that there are multiple ways in which adequate systems are developed across the U.S. federally regulated bulk electricity system. So that's the scope of the content today. Think of the continental United States. You might hear me say CONUS, but we're talking about FERC-regulated CONUS and also ERCOT, which technically is not FERC, that's the grid in Texas. Since state efforts to restructure the power system in the 1990s, we've had 2 types of wholesale electricity markets. On the left here, you'll see regulated wholesale markets, and that's sort of how everything was before the restructuring. So regulated wholesale markets, which are run by vertically integrated utilities, today that's primarily found in the West, in the white states that are shown out west, and then the white states that are shown in the image here to the south, and particularly in the southeast. And then secondly, to the right hand side of this slide, restructured wholesale markets. And this was the change, which run competitive markets through regional transmission organizations or independent system operators. Restructured regions are highlighted and labeled on the map here, and the non-colored CONUS regions are the regulated regions, to be clear. And you can see them listed. We'll come back to these definitions throughout, but particularly later in the presentation when we think about this emerging method that I alluded to earlier. For the regulated regions, the assessment of capacity offerings of various resources is important because it can be referenced in procurement decisions. Remember, those need to be regulator approved in these regulated regions, often as part of an integrated resource plan or IRP. The assessment of capacity also informs bilateral contracting in these areas, which are required because there aren't competitive markets for it to secure energy and capacity. So bilateral contracts are key, and they need a sense for the assessment of capacity of resources to form those contracts. And finally, because such an assessment provides an economic reference for capacity secured on the demand side through demand response or energy efficiency programs. And here you can think of an avoided cost reference for an economic estimate. Switching to restructured wholesale markets on the right-hand side of the slide, the assessment of capacity offering of a resource is used to incentivize investment and encourage robust market participation, to guide markets towards securing long-term reliability through adequacy of supply, and also to support other planning efforts such as that for transmission to deliver the needed capacity. One more note on this slide is that capacity markets are not the only way to secure sufficient capacity within these restructured areas. Two exceptions are found in Alberta and Texas. Both AESO and ERCOT, the system operators in those two respective regions, do not operate forward capacity markets, and instead they rely upon energy prices. And in the extreme events, you may have heard the term scarcity prices when energy is limited, and those can be quite high. These high prices are thought to incentivize capacity in those moments and encourage investment for the right capacity to be on the system. It's worth noting that some conjecture that in a world with increasing energy storage systems, this approach may become more common. But for now and for the remainder of this webinar, we're going to treat those two as an exception, and we're going to focus on the role of capacity assessment today through accreditation. Of those two worlds we discussed on the past slide, markets are fairly straightforward. Once a capacity is assessed for a given resource, the owner of that resource bids into a market at this capacity, and the market clears with the capacity needed at the lowest possible system cost. But the resource planning process is a bit more complicated and important to understand before we wade into conventional accreditation. By the way, here is the first time we're defining what we mean by resource accreditation. That is a formal acknowledgement of a resource capacity contribution by a system planner or market operator. I emphasize the word contribution here because there's much more to this than nameplate ratings of generators. It matters where and when and to what certainty a resource can provide power. No resource is perfect, remember, or 100% firm. Every resource is accredited for capacity at less than its nameplate capacity, nameplate rating, in almost all of the methods that we'll talk about today. Back to the standard planning process, in which resources are centrally planned to one or multiple objectives established around affordability, reliability, which includes resource adequacy, but also NERC contingency standards, and finally, public policy objectives at the state or federal level. These objectives are considered under the capacity expansion optimization shown on this image in the larger blue box in the middle of the image, but slightly to the right and lower in the frame. Resource adequacy is a subcomponent of resource planning, and resource planning is not only done for adequacy. Adequacy is more of a check to make sure that the generation mix planned under whatever objectives are guiding the system plan is sufficient to meet loads at all hours anticipated in the planning horizon. I want to call your attention to a critical feedback loop on this slide, and this is really the point of showing the slide and getting into this. This feedback loop happens in the highlighted box at the far right of the image. With and the way that touches the capacity expansion model. Within the capacity expansion optimization, resource adequacy evaluates how much effective capacity each resource is providing and how a generation mix that is deemed to be least cost by the capacity expansion model meets a pre-established resource criterion or resource criteria. And just a side note, a commonly cited criterion is 0.1 loss of load event days per year, LOLE, you've probably heard of. But there are more sophisticated metrics around loss of load hours, normalized unserved energy, value or risk, conditional value or risk. There's a whole field here on the adequacy criteria to use in planning, and folks and systems planners across the CONUS are in different places here on what metric they use. But for just to simplify this conversation, I'll refer to LOLE of 0.1 event days per year, loss of load expectancy. But you could substitute in a different criterion. If this example criterion is not met, meaning an LOLE of greater than 0.1 event days per year, the RA model indicates that more capacity is required and communicates back to the capacity expansion model that an increased planning reserve margin, or PRM, is needed. The planning reserve margin may be thought of as a factor beyond mean peak load to which system capacity must aggregate. Next, the capacity expansion optimization resolves the system under the new PRM, and then that mix would be considered again in the resource adequacy model. Resource accreditation, at the upper right of this image, is revisited as the resource mix changes. If there were too many generating resources and the LOLE was less than 0.1 event days per year, then the system is overly costly, and the resource adequacy model would signal a reduced PRM to the capacity expansion model. This process continues until convergence tolerance on RA criterion is achieved, resulting ultimately in an adequate, least cost capacity expansion solution. This is important because planners must balance reliability and affordability. This kind of coupling has been done in a semi-manual way in the past and is becoming more automated currently. But regardless, accreditation plays a crucial role, I hope you can see that from this slide, in the shaping of electricity systems which meet overall affordability, reliability, and public policy objectives. All right, now we've got our context set, and let's work towards some key principles of resource accreditation, which have been put out by some fantastic work out of the Energy Systems Integration Group. I have references for all these sources, all these citations in italic. You will see they'll be at the end of the deck, which you should have available to you following the recording of this presentation. In their 2023 work, ESIG outlined these key principles for resource accreditation. Because accreditation is so impactful as part of the resource adequacy process, these principles have been cited in state planning dockets. They're also, I would say, informed by state planning efforts, and they may be familiar to you, but they're helpful for us to keep in mind as we go forward today. Read from the left to the right. Read from the left to the right. Non-discriminatory accreditation, first, aims to avoid favoring a certain technology or giving any positive or negative bias towards a specific technology. Given its link to system reliability, resource accreditation is not the proper place to pursue policy objectives. So if there are public policy objectives that are of interest to a given system, that should be part of the capacity expansion solution, and there should be constraints in place accordingly to guide the solution, and it should be assessed against those objectives and those constraints by the planning community. But the accreditation step is not the place to put those in and favor one technology over another. It really should be unbiased in that way, non-discriminatory. Secondly, accreditation should be robust because there is quite a bit of change happening on the system, both on the supply and demand side, and resources may interact, as we'll discuss later. In the third box, the accreditation method must be transparent, and data must be readily available to ensure credibility of the planning process or market opportunity. People need to be able to understand how accreditation is working, and ideally, they should be able to reproduce the results. Accreditation needs to be reliable as assessed through how well the capacity actually shows up in real scarcity events of any one area and any one principle on this slide. more emphasis can be placed by the community as a whole going forward. When we're seeing a world with weather that perhaps we haven't seen in a long time or don't even have on record. And we've got changes on the generation and demand side that are significantly affecting the sufficiency of capacity. How well are these methods actually capturing what is happening on the system is a question that every planner should be asking continuously. Finally, accreditation needs to be predictable. The folks who are considering investments need to understand how their resources could be accredited on the system to marshal the resources required to serve that system. So these are the 5 pillars, the 5 guiding principles, I guess they're referred to as by ESIG, and I agree with them. I'd like you to keep these in mind as we go forward and as you think about accreditation, resource accreditation in the future. Now let's step back and consider how accreditation was done for years, when the system was typically reliant upon large generators, which could be located not too distant from load, and were dispatchable in times of need. We'll speak to the installed capacity method, and that's ICAP, that I referred to earlier, and the unforced capacity method, or UCAP. The installed capacity method first is the simplest accreditation technique and simply takes the generator nameplate as the accredited capacity, correcting for periods of planned maintenance. So if in 1 month in the spring, for example, there was planned maintenance for a certain generator, the ICAP in that month would be reduced because it was planned ahead of time. But otherwise, there isn't any adjustment to the capacity and the nameplate capacity through the typical implementation of the ICAP method. So how do you handle things like forced outage rates? That's all done through the PRM with the ICAP. And remember, that's the planning reserve margin. So these nameplate capacities of the resource types are summed across the generation mix, as you can see in the image on the left here, a small example that I've presented here on the slide. And a PRM is used to account for variations in annual peak load and operating reserves, including those to account for generator forced outage rates associated with unplanned maintenance. And that's the key difference between ICAP and UCAP. So the PRM is supposed to catch the forced outage rate of the generators by class, and the capacity expansion is resolved to come up to meet the capacity to match that total stack, as opposed to defining the amount of each resource class that accounts for the force outage rate of that class. Just a reminder that PRMs are typically 10 to 15% of aggregated system ICAP, or aggregated nameplate capacity of the generator classes. They can vary by system. Often a first stab would be 15% in that optimization loop that I spoke to a few slides back. As we discussed with the coupling between capacity expansion and resource adequacy, this resulted in a fairly large PRM that was required after ICAP summation, but it was effective in achieving reliability criterion and planning systems for many years. As the sensitivity, though, to thermal outages and the differences in thermal outages of older and newer units and across different types of units became clearer, this method was improved upon in the unforced capacity method. UCAP is similar to ICAP, except that it incorporates the effects of forced outage rate by generator type in the initial accreditation directly. One can see that this tries to account for the fact that some generators are more prone to forced outages than others, and reliability at lower cost was found by targeting more reliable units. Back to our feedback loop, what this ends up doing is lowering the overall PRM that needs to go to back into the capacity expansion, because the forced outage rate has already been taken into account when you accredited the resource classes. UCAP thus requires more nameplate capacity of each generator type so that the appropriate allocation by resource type and the generation mix can be made earlier on, and fewer iterations are required to arrive at an adequate least cost system in the planning case, and fewer resources are cleared in the market case. But of course, as we all know, the system has undergone drastic change in the last 20 to 30 years, and undoubtedly there's more change ahead. Here are the factors that are challenging those conventional approaches we just reviewed. They assume capacity during peak load is the most important time. And if you're tracking what's happening in systems with high penetration, That's not always the case any longer. We talk a lot about net peaks or critical periods, which aren't necessarily coinciding with the times of the maximum load on a system over the course of a year. Secondly, it assumes that there are only small differences in resource performance during these times. In this image on the right from one study several years ago, where wind generation resources were considered for their capacity potential across the West, you can see drastic variation depending on location, just as an example. This can be true of other resources as well. Third, it assumes that resources perform completely independently. This assumption made sense when you had thermal generation that wasn't linked to the weather as much as generation and demand are now. But we've also seen extreme weather bring correlated outages, even in this thermal generation fleet, on some systems, and more on that later. So these assumptions, while they were for a time, are not accurate enough for the systems that we have today. The reasons for that fall within 4 critical shifts in the power system that we'll mention specifically, but let's just talk about 3 on this slide for now, and I'll come back to the 4th later. First, as a function of the resource mix, we're seeing things happen off peak. If we think about the timing of load peaks differing from those of net load. And when I say net load, just to define the term, what I mean there is the native demand minus the variable production, energy production. So demand, power production, demand minus wind minus solar, typically people think of, but it could be other variable resources if those were on the system in appreciable numbers. So if the timing of the peak loads and the net load peaks are different in places like CAISO, and increasingly in other places in the country, that poses a nuance to planning that must be accounted for in the accreditation method and in the resource adequacy loss of load probability assessment. Secondly, there are key differences in resource performance during off-peak conditions because the capacity can be highly variable as a function of day and other meteorological conditions. Thirdly, resource performance is more interdependent than before. So the simple aggregation of capacities is ineffective. Increasingly, the capacity offering of one resource may be impacted by that of another. For all these reasons, there's a need to go away from some individual capacity units during peak loads and to think about portfolios of resources, portfolio value of capacity during evolving risk times. Within the evolution that we're discussing today, there have arisen deterministic and probabilistic approaches, and folks have various levels of comfort with these different approaches, which are important to consider. Deterministic methods for accreditation were standard in the conventional approach and are still used today because they are transparent and understandable. They're also easier to explain, and those are important elements for planners. However, they may also predetermine the risk periods. Less of a problem before, but could be a major drawback today, as we just discussed. They also may be limited in terms of what's available on the historical record. Often, resource adequacy, or RA, I'll say, studies are limited to the historical record, and purely deterministic approaches may be particularly constrained in this way. If there aren't enough years to draw a robust conclusion on what the future may hold, it may be difficult to draw actionable insights from deterministic modeling alone. Probabilistic models, on the other hand, will catch these different risk periods and typically be able to run enough weather and supply variability that statistically meaningful conclusions may be drawn, but they do so at the expense of complexity. They may be more difficult to understand, communicate, implement, and you can see elements of the 5 principles echoing here. There are various places in the country where deterministic approaches are still used effectively, I'll add. And Hawaiian Electric offers an interesting case study. HECO has historically considered hourly dependable capacity, which is looking at the variable generation in each hour out of a 5-year historical record, so deterministic in that way. The HDC accredits the capacity as the worst performance in that hour for every resource. This method does not assume coincident production. So if there was a high wind hour during a low solar hour, for example, only the worst solar hour and the worst wind hour for that hour of the year over the 5 hours that are available from the deterministic record that's being sampled, only the worst of both will be taken, irrespective of whether or not they were coincident. Instead, it just takes Historically, this HDC is met with an energy reserve margin, which is similar to a PRM to meet a zero point 0.1 LOLE criterion. You can see how there may be some drawbacks to this, but also that it's fairly easy to communicate and understand. Given how critical the stakeholder process is to planning, I want to emphasize again that this is a major strength of HDC. Please note also that HECO has refined this method by considering hourly expected capacity, which is what they currently are implementing in their resource adequacy work plan. The HEC does account for coincident weather, and they've also weighed probabilistic approaches in their recent resource adequacy work plan. So here's a planner who's scrutinizing various methods available to it and also considering its stakeholder process. And they continue to lean on a more deterministic look over a 5-year record. And it serves their needs. In terms of probabilistic methods, the term that many folks have heard, no doubt, is the effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. And if it's your first time hearing this, no problem. We'll walk you through it, and it's definitely something to be tracking as an important concept and definition in this field. The ELCC is a way to quantify the equivalent perfect capacity that an entire portfolio of generation or even a transmission change can support. Portfolio evaluation can be computationally intensive and difficult to describe and interpret, but it is a robust and reliable approach. There are 4 steps to calculating ELCC, which are depicted in the diagram at right. First, one calculates the loss of load expectancy, or substitute your RA criterion of preference here, normalized expected unserved energy. I've used that before. Could be other things, of course. A curve could be defined, like this blue curve here on the screen and the solid line that you see running from the lower left to the upper right on the plot. That could be defined by varying load and solving for the criterion at many points, but really only a reference point is needed for this calculation. So whatever your reference target is, that could be 0.1 LOLE, as it is on this plot. It could be something else. That's really the point that needs to be refined. I mentioned that because there's computational challenge in defining this curve, and really you need to get to your reference point, and that's really what matters. In step 2, one adds the change that is being considered to the generation or transmission mix, or both, and this will bring the system to a different loss of load expectancy level. If one is adding generation or transmission, generally you would expect the system will become more adequate, more reliable. You've added more things to it. And then in step 1, so generally, as in this diagram, we're stepping down on the y-axis. Third, load is incremented and the load is reassessed. Typically, there's an iteration between steps 2 and 3 to find the right amount of load that can be added to the system to return the system to that same reference in step 4, the same reference RA criterion level within a convergence tolerance in step 4. So that does take, I want to be clear, that's not exactly a simple step from 2 to 3. One has to add some load to the system, assess the reliability of that system against the resource adequacy criterion, and then adjust that guess. So if maybe you're too low the first time, you've got to add more to get to, or maybe you're too high, you have to back off on how much load you added to get to that 0.1 LOLE when you bring the system back. So really, the one thing I don't love about this diagram, I think it's helpful to consider the concept, but really from step 2 to 3, you just end up at 4. Basically, you've added load to the system and you've made it less reliable. So that's putting you on a different LOLE, on the same LOLE at a different load, a different demand for your system. And that change in demand is the effective load carrying capability of the change you modeled in the generation and or transmission increment that you're assessing in this step. You can probably tell from this description that these loss of load expectancy calculations are computationally intensive. Accurate loss of load models are required in surveys of many weather years and over many stochastic runs, sometimes called draws, like drawing a card from a deck, which consider the variable possibility of forced outages to form RA criterion evaluations necessary for a robust and reliable ELCC conclusion. So partially due to those challenges in calculating ELCC, several alternatives have arisen. They're not all weren't all motivated by, not all those that I'll show on this slide were motivated by simplifying ELCC, but some of them are. To start with, the equivalent firm capacity, and we'll go to the equivalent conventional power, equivalent conventional power also. Those two aren't necessarily simpler than ELCC. Instead, they take the calculation and operate it in reverse. So to go through that quickly, the system is brought to a RA criterion of reference, say that's 0.1 LLE, and then the generation transmission change of interest is removed. So it was in there to start with, then it's taken out, and generally the model becomes less adequate, right? LLE increases. Finally, a perfect, aka firm capacity is added to the model to bring it back to the reference RA criterion. So to get it back to 0.1, we've added capacity now, and that's then the difference between 3 and 1, or between the capacity addition between 3 and 1 would be the equivalent firm capacity. I'm referencing the image in the upper right. That would be the equivalent firm capacity of the change that the increment that you have been modeling. In this way, EFC allows one to equate X megawatts of a generation change to Y megawatts of perfect capacity. Now remember, there's no such thing as perfect capacity, but perfect capacity can be helpful to evaluate everything against the same standard. So you can consider different changes and weigh them against perfect capacity. That could be a common benchmark. Moving on to conventional capacity, which is not firm, is not perfect, and instead has planned maintenance, forced outage rate, and equipment D rates included. The equivalent conventional power may be computed. This could be valuable when trading options against conventional generation alternatives. So you can see that when you account for these losses, outages, I should call them D rates, outage rates, planned maintenance, that you need more capacity than the perfect generator. And that's why the light green in the image, the curve to the farthest to the right, in the plot at the very top of this screen crosses that 0.1 reference at a higher capacity addition. You need more of that imperfect resource than you would if it was a perfect resource to give the same resource adequacy criterion. Next, and this is the simplest way, I think, on the screen here, to estimate capacity credit and account for shifting periods of risk, crucially, is to average capacity factor during the top net load hours. Again, load minus wind minus solar typically is net load. So during those top net load hours, average the capacity factor over as many weather years as are available, and that average will become the capacity accredited by this method. To the extent that periods of risk are changing and they're not often at the system peak load times, this may offer a computationally efficient precursor to an ELCC, EFC, or ECP. Slightly more computationally intensive and requiring a loss of load model, but not as intensive as ELCC or EFC or ECP, is the Associated System Capacity Contribution, ASCC, which avoids the iteration around an RA criterion of reference. From one run of the loss of load model, over however many weather combinations and outage draws are available, the model sorts the unserved load hours in descending order. Loss of load probability in these hours, as measured against the full set of hours considered, is computed. Then the generation or transmission change is added, and the process is repeated. From these two runs alone, the ASCC can be interpreted from the shift in the curtailment curve at a reference loss of load probability. This was brought forward by the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, and they have extended the ASCC to multidimensional surfaces. I personally have used ASCC in my work and can attest to how much simpler it is than the ELCC. And it may be helpful if a more simple method is needed or there are some restrictions on computational resources and complexity of the method. It is, however, less common than ELCC. Next on the list, there's a direct loss of load method. MISO has referred to this recently, and we'll actually show an example of this shortly, where one simply runs a loss of load model that considers the capacity that's available at every system shortfall and then averages the capacity during all those periods as the accredited capacity. The trick to this method is defining the periods of system shortfall, as there may not be many actual hours of unserved energy to make a meaningful average. There are many other methods which were developed on the way to these more prevalent approaches today that are worth reading about in the Madani et al. 2012 reference, which I'll have at the end of the presentation. Why is it important to consider portfolio capacity effects? There are interactive effects of resource mixes today of which to be mindful. The first is saturation. This is the idea that as you add more and more of a resource with the same temporal characteristics, then it provides less diversity of supply to the system over time. Thermally, thermal dispatchable resources will be less susceptible to this effect. Back to that duck curve example, as more and more solar is added to the California system, the marginal value of solar resource decreases. In any modern accreditation method we have discussed, the first megawatt of solar in this example would have been accredited with much more favorably than the last megawatt of solar today. This will happen for any resource with relatively fixed temporal production characteristics, which relates to the second effect on the screen here, diversity. Diversity is the opposite of saturation. If one can start to harness differences in temporal characteristics of generation, considering how those correlate with demand, there will be improvements to the portfolio capacity value. Note, if you add diversity at times when demand does not present in the middle of the night, this is less helpful. But if you think about net load peak hours and the ability of a resource to complement a decreasing solar capability as the sun sets, you can start to understand how diversity of resources can be a powerful way to enhance portfolio capacity value. Finally, there is the synergy of resources where some combinations in particular extend the capacity value of the parts so that the summation of capacity of 2 or 3 resources can be larger than if they were considered separately. A great example of this would be solar with 4-hour energy storage, and that's shown here from the work of Schlag et al. If you consider just the capacity offering of each one of those things, they are significant in and of themselves. But if you consider them together, it's even better. The solar provides the energy that the battery needs at the time when the system most needs it. And that's how there's more capacity offered by the combination than by the individual components. The capacities of the solar and battery resources in this example sum to 13.5 gigawatts, but the interactive effect is worth an additional 1.7 gigawatts. You may have heard me mention marginal contributions. Now that one considers these interactive effects and thinks about portfolio values of capacity, one can appreciate the importance of marginal effective load carrying capability, or MELCC. A lot of acronyms today, bear with me. These marginal curves can be considered as the tangent or the first derivative of the ELCC curve. If you think about the portfolio ELCC as the capacity of one resource changes, that is the marginal ELCC. If you consider how this curve changes as more capacity is offered to the system, you can imagine how saturation might resemble the plot at the upper right. Marginal ELCC tells the planner how many megawatts of perfect capacity that a resource is worth. When marginal ELCCs are aggregated across the portfolio, and they'll be different for different resource types, resource saturation and diversity are captured. When considered as a portfolio ELCC, the summation of all the marginal values from all the different resources on the system, and then any interactive effects like those we just spoke of are added on top of those is defined. In other words, marginal ELCC will capture saturation and diversity benefits by resource, and portfolio ELCC loops in any resource synergies. Now let's revisit our key shifts in the power system sector, which are driving the needs for new approaches to accreditation. The fourth critical shift, and one that has presented a bit more recently and vividly for us, is that there may be widespread underperformances of conventional resources during major meteorological events such as winter storms. This could also be true in heat waves or other extreme conditions affecting large geographic areas. The challenge is twofold. First, if the planner simply considers the UCAP method, in which nameplate capacities are derated to account for forced outages, they are unlikely to properly capture the system-wide effect of these thermal outages simply because the probability of loss of load grows significantly with thermal outages, given the nature of the systems we have today and how reliant they are on thermal. A stochastic loss of load model will properly capture this potential for multiple thermal forced outages to drive significant increases in loss of load. And this applies even if thermal outages are completely random and uncorrelated. If you use a UCAP or any kind of capacity summation method, the conventional methods we talked about before, you will favorably accredit capacity to thermal generation compared to a stochastic method, which captures the potential for more of these things to happen concurrently. So it's important to use these more sophisticated methods to capture the effect of uncorrelated and random outages of the thermal fleet, which have an outsized impact on adequacy. But secondly, and this might be the one people are thinking of, and certainly the one the plot here is speaking to, weather effects have driven widespread correlated thermal outages with catastrophic effects on the system. To account for these effects, weather derates and weather coincidence to capture these impacts is critical, and the thermal fleet should be assessed like other resources. In fact, these reductions in capacity are not unlike the diurnal loss of solar production at sunset every day, and similar methods should be applied to the thermal fleet as are to the solar fleet. As an example, one can see that during Winter Storm Uri, shown in red, are correlated thermal outages due to the weather, which directly corresponded with loss of load events. This kind of correlation, in which performance is linked to weather, needs to be detectable through the RA model and the resulting accreditation as best practice. There are also differences in methods concerning their prospective, forward-looking, or retrospective, backward-looking approaches. Prospective approaches are simulation-based and consider future weather to estimate performance of resources in the periods that are of most concern. This allows one to capture and represent resources which perhaps aren't well represented in the record, or weather which isn't well represented in the historical record also. Retrospective approaches rely upon measured performance during observed risk. Retrospective approaches can rely upon measured performance, which allows one to credibly stack uncertainties and risks that aren't typically simulated. By leveraging history, retrospective approaches reward operational performance under tight margins and thereby create an incentive. Either of these can use deterministic or probabilistic approaches. A prospective deterministic approach may run future weather mixes through historical weather only, but consider new periods of risk which emerge. A retrospective probabilistic approach may consider only measured performances as a function of weather during observed risk periods, but then consider different historical weather combinations. Most commonly, prospective approaches, though, implement probabilistic methods, and retrospective take a deterministic approach. Given these differences, you might think a planner would pick one or the other, but actually some of the more sophisticated planners for reliability and resource adequacy consider hybrids of these methods. MISO provides a great example whereby resource class, they consider a probabilistic prospective approach with the direct loss of load method that we discussed earlier. This allows them to capture new low margin hours and the contribution of an evolving portfolio of resources. Then at the unit level, they consider retrospective deterministic approaches. A retrospective deterministic approach where they look at the historical production during hours of high risk from that probabilistic model. This allows them to simulate the future while representing technology performance in a credible way that can be cited and easily understood. Because it's a sophisticated example, I wanted to spend a little time stepping through MISO's two-part process. First, on the left here, a class level consideration of direct loss of load value based on a modeled loss of load expectancy is completed. MISO finds these hours of tight margins highlighted in the orange boxes in the graphic at lower left, and they consider what the generator class is providing during those same hours in the model, highlighted in green. Then, an average of all this production is computed by hour to a credit capacity by class. Next, the resource class value, we're going to the right side of the screen now, then the resource class value is allocated to individual resource based on how well they have performed in the recent record. Specifically, MISO defines two tiers of critical hours and weights them separately. The tier 2 hours are those shown to have loss of load in the probabilistic model and are weighted at 80%. The tier 1 hours are those with low margins, but not loss of load, and are weighted at 20%. These weights then result in the intermediate seasonal accredited capacity, or ISAC, in the table at the lower right, by plant. So now you're getting down to the plant level. Finally, the seasonal accredited capacity by plant is normalized so that the aggregates equate to the class level direct loss of load value, in this case, 50 megawatts in total. This method allows for individual plant performance to be acknowledged because not all plants within the same class are operated or maintained equally. The approach allows individual plants to be attributed based on the way they have been operated, which in turn sharpens the capacity calculation for the whole system. The final shift in methods is this movement from an average towards marginal accreditation approach based on the evolution of a system within the planning phase or as capacity markets clear. While even 5 years ago, there was significant discussion around how to average the initial and final marginal ELCCs and to apportion portfolio effects among resources, marginal accreditation has emerged as the latest accreditation technique. Here, the idea is to value what a resource is giving you on the margin, closest to the final generation mix, which captures the change in the contribution to overall capacity as a function of the portfolio. Commonly dubbed the marginal reliability improvement, or MRI method, it is the most economically efficient signal for markets, but also for planning, and has been adopted by New York ISO, ISO New England, PJM, and CAISO so far, and it's under consideration in other locations. Despite its promise, there are 3 drawbacks to mention. The first, because accreditation is not fixed and is a function of the portfolio, saturation can occur quickly and the competitive energy markets can shift rapidly. Similar to energy or ancillary service markets, it's more difficult for people to plan for a price signal that might come out of this in the future as the system changes. Secondly, it doesn't describe any value to what an asset did in the even recent past. It's all about what have you done for me lately? For example, that solar generator that may have provided helpful capacity only a few years ago, but now is largely saturated, and a given grid would not, on a given grid, would not be valued for much capacity or any capacity going forward, even though it was crucial to ensuring the building up of the system to get to the point where it is today. Finally, if a resource is providing energy to a storage asset, it will not be rewarded equitably for the capacity contribution that energy enabled. Storage can be dispatched in a new net load peak. That energy contribution, which is so critical to the capacity offering of a storage asset, simply isn't acknowledged, even though storage can shift that energy around by the marginal method. So these are some of the drawbacks. There are responses by the people who've come up with this method that I'm not mentioning here, but some of these drawbacks are similar to other market products. And the point is ultimately that it is an efficient signal. So it's giving you what you really need. It's incentivizing what the system really needs right at the time, at its current state or closest to its planned state, maybe, however many years out when the planning cycle is considering that system. A little bit more of a deep dive into how this marginal reliability improvement method could work. First, there is a total reliability need, which is based on the perfect capacity needed to meet the relevant resource adequacy criterion. But that's different than the total procurement need, which is the amount of resources that need to be procured to meet the critical periods which increasingly occur off-peak. The total procurement need is largely a function of the penetration of variable and energy-limited resources. From E3 research, and by the way, this Olson et al. 2025 paper is a great reference if you want to know more about this method. The total procurement need declines from 110% of median peak load for no renewables to 77% in ERCOT, which is half composed of wind and solar resources. PJM indicates that the total procurement need is 94% of median peak load. So just let that sit for a second. PJM is saying that procurement need is less than the median peak load. And that's the key to this method. And that's not something that we would have seen in the past. Remember, the total reliability need is actually met through imperfect resources, as we know. Marginal ELCC calculations are summed across resources, and then any interactive effects meet the total reliability need. Resource classes are accredited at their marginal ELCC. That's how this works. Resource classes are accredited at their marginal ELCC. The marginal ELCC is the capacity that one can say is associated with any individual resource type. And then the interactive effects simply cover the difference between the net load peaks and the peak. So if you can meet the net load peaks, then you're guaranteed to make the peak times. MRI results in lower procurement than ICAP because resource unavailability is appropriately accounted for in accreditation rather than socialized in the PRM. And that's true, referencing to UCAP as well. Finally, we need to discuss the way that demand-side resources can participate as capacity resources, and that can be part of the MRI calculation. Marginal demand allocation may also be an economically efficient way to value contributions from the demand side. Just like capacity supply side resources, demand side resources must be considered during hours of tight margin rather than during the peak. Load reduction during the net peak is helpful for reliability, just like capacity addition then is then. However, the difference is that efforts focused on reducing load during peak could actually diminish or degrade the ability of loads to respond during net load peaks. And an example would be deferring a load during the peak only to need or incur that load several hours later, precisely when the net load peak hits. And you've actually, in that example, you've done more harm than good. You've made the problem worse. And that could make the adequacy problem worse, and an MRI approach would reflect this derogation. In this way, load participation in these methods may be lagging, and as a community, we should consider the hours upon which load participation is focused do as a contribution to system adequacy. Okay, everybody take a deep breath. That was a lot. Finally, to recap what we covered on this webinar. Resource accreditation is critical for the planning of resources within regulated markets, but also the construction and participation within competitive capacity markets. Within restructured markets, there are some places where spot pricing directly sends a signal to investors, and as systems evolve, that might become more common. But for most grids today and for the near future, resource accreditation will be a critical part of planning or to guide market participation for capacity markets. We reviewed ESIG's 5 principles of resource accreditation, which were influenced by and are cited by and remain relevant to state planners. These principles are listed as the following adjectives: non-discriminatory, robust, transparent, reliable, and predictable. Next, we reviewed conventional accreditation through ICAP and UCAP approaches. They both rely heavily upon nameplate capacity ratings as the primary way to accredit capacity, and they sum these ratings to provide sufficient adequacy with the use of a planning reserve margin that accounts for variability of peak loads and operating reserves, including forced outages in the case of ICAP. With UCAP, though, these forced outages are considered in the accreditation by resource class upfront directly. Then we reviewed major shifts in the electricity system, which drive new methods for evaluating capacity. These include the emergence of tight capacity margins off-peak rather than during peak load times. There are large differences in resource performance during these conditions. Resource performance is more interdependent than before, and loss of load is more likely during significant thermal outages. So forced outage D rates are insufficient even for random and uncorrelated outages. We also saw that correlated thermal outages deserve treatment just like smaller generators, which can be affected by large weather patterns. And the example was solar power reduction as the sun goes down every day. We reviewed current practices spanning deterministic or probabilistic approaches, retrospective or prospective approaches, and average or marginal accreditation techniques. We reviewed examples and considered various accreditation techniques leveraging these approaches. Due to interactive effects such as saturation, diversity, and resource synergy, it's important to consider combined portfolio effect when thinking through capacity accreditation and resource adequacy planning. Due to interactive effects such as, finally, an emerging method, the marginal reliability improvement method, focusing on the marginal capacity from both supply and demand sides was reviewed. It allows for economically efficient signals which can adapt to changes in the power system and may offer the most efficient way to secure long-term reliability at least cost. With that, I'll show my references here. Hopefully you can get access to the slides through the website as well. Back to you, Pete.
Thanks, Travis. That's great. Really appreciate all the information today. Sure our folks in the audience do as well. And so with that, let me close things out by just pitching a technical assistance program that actually was the genesis for this webinar series. The Department of Energy not only funded this webinar, but also a much bigger program that provides support to state energy offices and state regulators. It's called the Resources and Assistance for State Energy Offices and Regulators Program, a very, very creative name. You can see the link on the left-hand side as well as a QR code to access the program. We offer 3 different types of TA. First and foremost is our help desk. This gives you 4 hours to talk to someone like Travis. You've got a couple questions about the difference between ICAP and UCAP. He's your guy. This is a request that can be submitted through a very simple intake form on our website. We also have the ability to get a little bit more support from subject matter experts across the lab complex. Our expert match makes them available for up to 100 person hours. Here, we're potentially able to do maybe some small analytical projects, research activity, provide some feedback to you on filings or regulatory proceedings or development of programs through an energy office. Last but not least is what we call our deep dive. This is basically anything above 100 hours. These are more typically TA activities that require 6 to 9 to 12 months of effort from a team of lab subject matter experts. Unfortunately, at this time, this technical assistance activity or this type of TA is not available. We are hoping that depending on what comes out of the FY26 congressional budget process, that we will be able to offer this in the future. And so please do consider accessing technical assistance in any of these three forms through our website list on the left-hand side. And so with that, I want to thank you all for listening in today. Please do check out the other recordings of our webinars in this series. All of those can be accessed at that same website, statetaprogram.lbl.gov. And last but not least, if you have any questions about the material that you heard today, please do consider reaching out directly to Travis. His contact information is listed there. And so with that, again, I want to thank you all for attending and listening, and we will hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.